One of the reasons I'm proud to support this bill is because it takes a truly comprehensive approach to the problem. It supports crisis centers for women and families so that they can get immediate needs like shelter and counseling. And last year, the New Hampshire Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence reported that they were able to provide shelter for 630 people who needed a place to sleep. Unfortunately, although they helped those 630, they had to turn away 721 because they just didn't have room. So even with the help that's in the Violence Against Women Act, they had to turn away more people than they can help. In the face of this need, sometimes it's easy to feel discouraged, to wonder whether we can really help at all. But when I speak to the brave women who are survivors, they've reached out for help. The advocates who have helped them rebuild their shattered lives, I know that we can and we must continue to make a difference. The Violence Against Women Act helps us do this by providing funding for police officers and prosecutors so abusers are held responsible. And time and again, we've heard from law enforcement that the Violence Against Women Act helps them keep our communities safe. It helps stop the cycle of abuse. Law enforcement officers like Detective Sargent in New Hampshire's largest city of Manchester, who is an investigator and a domestic violence advocate. Now, I brought with me today a chart that gives us a real picture of just how pervasive the problem of domestic violence is. As we can see in the chart, 1 in 4 women in the United States are victims of domestic violence. 3 women are murdered every day by their partners. This has been a very big problem in New Hampshire, where half of all murders are domestic violence related. And maybe the worst statistic on this chart shows that 15 million children are exposed to domestic violence every year. And I call this maybe the worst because, in fact, the cycle of domestic violence continues because we have so many children who are exposed every year, because they're not able to get out of this cycle. So let us today recommit to shielding our children from senseless violence. Now, another reason that I'm proud to support this bill is because it treats all victims equally, and it recognizes that members of the LGBT community are just as deserving of our support as any other survivor of domestic violence. A recent study by the Centers for Disease Control tells us that those in LGBT relationships actually experience domestic violence at a higher rate than heterosexual couples. So let us today recommit to providing help for all Americans, regardless of who they love or who has abused them. And finally, I want to end with a quote from a woman in New Hampshire who sought help at a crisis center that receives funds from VAWA, the Monadnock Center for Violence Prevention. Before she left that shelter, as she was putting her life back together, she told the case managers there, and I quote, "You all have really made my life worth holding on to and not giving up. Please don't ever give up doing what you do, because you truly saved my life." I think that represents what we hear from so many survivors of domestic violence. And just as we're not going to give up on those survivors, we must not give up until this legislation is on President Obama's desk, until it's signed into law. There are too many victims who are counting on us. I certainly urge all of my colleagues in the Senate, as we did in the last session of Congress, to join me in supporting the Violence Against Women Act, and I certainly hope our colleagues in the House will recognize how significant this challenge is and be willing to take up this legislation and get it done so that survivors across this country get the help they need. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I yield the floor.